I'm not only a research associate at ESI, but I'm also a PhD student, and my PhD is about restrictions on movement of data and what really drives governments to impose restrictions on moving data cross-border. And one of these reasons might be cybersecurity. Others are national security concerns, privacy, etc. And I'm trying to really understand the real reasons behind these restrictions and whether restricting movement of data cross-border actually achieves the purpose of the government. And this is very much concerned with the presentation that I'm going to make today. So what I want to do is to start by, I'm pushing the right one, no, okay. By getting the terminology right. I think there is a lot of confusion between data privacy, cybersecurity, national security, etc. So I want to briefly talk about this and present some definitions. And then I'm going to talk about the don'ts and the do's of the cybersecurity. I'm going to make some examples about current policies that I think don't really achieve the purpose they are designed for, and actually other suggestions that might be better suited to achieve the purpose of cybersecurity. So, about the terminology. I think that's the best definition I could find about cybersecurity. It's the body of technologies, processes, and practices designed to protect networks, computers, programs, and data from attack, damage, or unauthorized access. So it's really everything has to do with making sure that data isn't used or accessed by people that are not supposed to tamper with the data. And this has different elements which cover also network security, application security, information security, disaster recovery, and also end user training. And when it comes to cyber threats, there are 4 types of main cyber threats that we can the companies and governments can face. First of all, general crimes, so fraud, denial of service attacks, anything has to do with malware, ransomware, etc. Commercial espionage, in which basically someone is targeting the trade secrets and other economic intelligence of competitors. National state espionage, in which one state is targeting the sensitive information of other governments. And warfare, which is rather acts of war made through the internet or through some internet activity. Then, something which is connected and can then have impacts on cybersecurity is the access of data for law enforcement and national security reasons. This is something that also it was referred to at the beginning when we talked about backdoors. I'm going to refer to it also later in the presentation. This is something that has nothing to do with cybersecurity per se, but in the moment in which governments request access to data for law enforcement or for national security reasons, this might have also implications on cybersecurity. And I'm going to make some examples later in the presentation. Other issue is data privacy. Data privacy is basically about making sure that the personal information of citizens is protected. And it's different from cybersecurity in the sense that cybersecurity is actually about the infrastructure and making sure that all data remains protected, while this is data privacy is really about the privacy of the individual, and also making sure that all the rules about collection and dissemination of data are put in place and respected. And finally, freedom of expression. This is something like a term that I put there to kind of cover some issues which we are talking about today, like fake news, censorship, hate speech, etc. And this also is not directly concerned with cybersecurity, but there are cases in which the implementation of rules that are supposed to achieve this kind of purposes can have implications on cybersecurity. And an example might be the case of China, in which what we see is that the Chinese government is having a direct influence on the infrastructure of the telecommunication infrastructure of China. And what you see there are so-called autonomous systems, these 3 points, which are basically points, central located routing systems through which all data that enters China has to pass through. This means that in this way, the Chinese government can have easy and direct access to certain data because they know through which gate is going to pass at some point. Like 75% of data is passing through a single routing system in China. But this also has clear implication of the sustainability of the infrastructure, telecommunication infrastructure, and the safety of the infrastructure in China. And this is instead how a network which develops more naturally would look like instead. So let me start talking about the don'ts now. I think, first of all, that we are all aware that the fragmentation within the EU, between member states, is a problem. And actually, the NIS directive put it very clearly in recital 5, and they say that we have different level of preparedness in Europe, which has led to a fragmented approach across the Union, and an equal level of protection of consumers and businesses, which undermines the overall security of networks in Europe. However, the problem is that the NIS directive does not really solve the problem. I think actually makes it worse. Because Article 7 of the directive leaves to member states wide range of freedom in terms of implementation of the directive, which is going to create further fragmentation in Europe. And member states are allowed to create their own national security strategy. There's going to be coordination, but this doesn't mean that they are going to all have the same rules. And they also can choose the appropriate policy and regulatory measures to achieve this objective, which I think can be quite problematic. And also member states have the freedom to choose the penalties that they want to impose to companies that are not going to respect these rules. And again, this can be very problematic because certain companies, especially certain operators, have to respect the rules of different member states, and they're going to face different regulations, different penalties, and they're going to have different incentives to comply or not with these regulations. Second problem, which I think is a problem, is notification of incidents. I think overall, notifying incidents is something that should be, of course, done. It's something that it's needed, and government authorities and agencies should work together with companies when there are this kind of vulnerabilities and incidents. The problem is that companies are required to do it without undue delay. And there are a lot of reports and complaints from companies that show that the need to notify immediately a vulnerability in the moment in which it's discovered by the company can actually increase the vulnerability of the company. If they are not aware that are not aware of the solution to this vulnerability, presenting this problem to the government might increase the cost of the company to tackle this vulnerability. It might actually, your face is, I can talk more about this, but it's actually a problem, and there is also a survey that has been recently published by the FT, which is done by IBM and Pokémon Institute, Institute, which shows that the rush to notify and the involvement of third party increases the cost of a security breach. Other issue is compulsory standards. The NIS directive is not imposing compulsory standards per se, but is leaving to the member states the possibility to impose certain standards. And I think the Article 19 of the directive has two problems. First of all, the fact that they talk about European standards, not only international standards, but also European, and this is the risk to fragment further the market and to restrict interoperability globally. And the second issue is that member states are left the freedom to impose compulsory standards if they want to. And this again can have serious implications because in the moment in which you create a standard fixed list of standards, companies might feel obliged to just tick the boxes and make sure that these standards are complied with without really having a more deeper and comprehensive approach to cybersecurity, which is what actually we need to promote. And actually, the European Union has already fought harshly against those countries that are trying to impose compulsory standards which discriminate against foreign hardware or products. And these are, for example, 3 regulations: the multi-level protection scheme in China, the preferential market access program in India, and the new cybersecurity law which was implemented in June this year in China. These are 3 cases in which governments are imposing standards which are national and are not global, and they have been hardly criticized for doing so. So the European Union, by imposing national standards, might also justify these governments to continue imposing this kind of national standards. And the justification that these governments give when they impose these standards is that they really don't want to discriminate against foreign standards. They just do it because they want to boost consumer confidence. This is the same reasons that the European Union is giving. So we cannot use the same reasoning and same justification to impose similar restrictions that actually discriminate against international standards. and products. And actually, also imposing standards which might not actually be designed for cybersecurity, as the case of Theresa May, which is now talking about the need to have backdoors and make sure that criminals are not left free in the internet, is something that can also have implications on cybersecurity, as we know. We already spoke about it earlier. We can talk about it later in the discussion, but shortly, having backdoors doesn't work. It's backdoors for good purposes, designed for good purposes, are going to be abused by people that do not have good purposes. And finally, another don't is the delocalization issue. The new cybersecurity law of China is envisioning also the need to localize data locally and to store them domestically in China. Only critical information, we're going to see what this means when they tell more information about the implementation of these rules. And they also say that if data has to leave the country, they have to conduct security assessment to make sure that when data leaves the country, actually still secure outside China. This does not increase cybersecurity, for sure. The cybersecurity is not connected to the location in which data is stored. It's about how data is treated and the whole process around making sure the data is properly encrypted and properly secured. And it's designed to achieve other purposes, which for China is national security and public order. And we have to make sure that China and other countries that are imposing this kind of regulation with the excuse of protecting the security of data of the citizens are rather cannot basically continue using this excuse to impose this kind of regulations. And this is something that is happening a lot lately. We see huge increase in restrictions on movement of data, which are often justified with different reasoning. As I was saying at the beginning, like some countries like France have now imposed some restrictions on public procurement and require to store data locally in case of public procurement. In this case, it's also national security reasons, but we have to be very careful because this can actually even increase the vulnerability of data. If data is stored locally, it's easier to access it and to hack it in some cases. So to conclude, the do's. I'm not going to go too much in detail into the do's because I think this is much better left to specialists, which are more technical specialists in this area. So what I did is rather to list some suggestions that are made by people that are specialized in this topic. First of all, focus on systems that are truly critical in nature. What we see with the NIS is that app stores are put at the same level of critical infrastructure like transportation infrastructure. It's very important not to expand these restrictions related to standards to sectors and services which are not critical. Otherwise, certain companies are gonna need to move important resources of the company just to tick these boxes and make sure they comply with the regulation, even if they don't really need to undergo these strict checkings. Other issues, and this is something that the NIS is partially covering properly, is improving public agencies, improve coordination both intra-EU and globally, develop national security plans, involve the private sector in the development of security strategies, invest in R&D, increase private-public partnerships, and participate in international foreign consortia. So to conclude, I just wanted to mention again, it's already been mentioned before, that there is a framework developed in the US by the NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, which is now undergoing update, which is actually very good. This framework is something which is open to being applied also abroad. It's voluntary. It's not imposing any strict standard to companies, so that they have the freedom to design the cybersecurity strategy that best suit their needs. And the most interesting thing about the framework is that it puts cybersecurity from a perspective of risk management, which is, I think, very important. It's not about making sure that data is always going to be safe and secure, because it's impossible. We saw before 71% of companies are hacked every year, according to the stat we saw before. So we cannot ensure that data is always secure, but what we can do is to implement a set of a procedure of risk management, which includes not only the software provider, but also the hardware provider, the governments, and the end user, to make sure that risk is minimized. And also companies are prepared to respond to the issues that are going to come. And my last slide is just a quick reminder that I think it's very important to preserve interoperability and openness in the global market. And it is very important to have a dialogue and make sure that cybersecurity needs are also balanced with other concerns of civil liberties, such as privacy, innovation, trade, and other policy priorities like national security. So if we have a sincere dialogue and look at the real reasons behind imposing certain regulations from countries, we can actually together achieve a framework which is better suited to achieve these purposes. I'll leave you with this quote, which I think is very pertinent to the cybersecurity challenge. Thank you.